I'm David Dillon. I was the architecture critic at the Dallas Morning News for 23 years. I got to know Howard fairly early on in my career in the early 80s as I was looking about trying to find interesting work and trying to get a sense of the kind of history of Dallas architecture. And Howard's name kept coming up, but I hadn't seen the work. So I was there for 23 years, knew him through the latter part of his life. I'm currently teaching in the architecture school at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. I wrote 2 or 3 articles about Howard, and I think probably the first one was the first article that had been written about Howard in 25 years, probably since Temple Emanuel. So I became a friend and an enthusiast, and even greater admirer of his work. I mean, the best of Howard's work is very, very good. And but I was also intrigued by the fact that in the course of his career, he had worked in more than one mode. He wasn't exclusively an international style architect. I mean, he did probably the best Georgian house in Dallas on White Rock Lake. And it's kind of a wonderful building and makes all of the kind of pseudo-Georgian houses that have come along since look really perfunctory and glib. He could do a French provincial house. That wasn't his chosen mode, but like many architects of that particular period, he could work in many different styles. So it was intriguing to me, even though his heart was clearly with Corbusier, with Frank Lloyd Wright, with the modernists, that he was able to work very expertly in other styles and other modes. So that sort of struck me as he was not a purist in that sense. You know, he was not a doctrinaire, kind of narrowly ideological modernist. He knew where he was, and he was always looking around for ways to Texas up things, is the way he would put it. You know, sort of he would use soft brick, Mexican brick. He would use a lot of wood when he could. But he was he was both a man of very strong convictions and very strong opinions, as any of his clients, I'm sure, will tell you. You know, Howard did not believe that God had put him on this earth to make life easy for his clients. I mean, he was very determined, but on the other hand, very skillful in the way in which he executed his modern work. I think architects are increasingly aware of Howard's work and the work that he had done. I don't know necessarily that a lot of clients are as aware of the value of his work as architects have been, because he's lost a lot of work. Many of his best houses have been torn down. Sadly, they were not, for in some cases for nothing, just a vacant lot, just the price of the lot. In other cases, to replace it with some sort of glorified neo-Georgian, neo-colonial hodgepodge, as far as I could see. But so I think it's the clients aren't necessarily as I think maybe as aware, have not been necessarily as aware of Howard's work and its importance as others have been. You know, architects and architecture students. I think, you know, to use a really bad word, timeless. I think Howard's best work is hard to date very precisely. I mean, it could be 1940 or it could be 1990. There are qualities to it that are just enduring, I think, and I think that's one of the qualities of his work that's very, very important. It is not dated. It does not look, a Howard Meyer house does not look dated. There are plenty of houses now that one can say, oh, that house, oh, that's February 1994, you know, or that's January 1998. I mean, they are so fashion conscious, so time specific. And Howard's work is not like that at all. I mean, I think he loved to make places where people could be comfortable, and he's a real materialist. His use of materials is always, I think, very impressive. He loved Mexican brick. He loved redwood siding. He loved teak and brass and metals and things like that. He really knew how to put materials together. I think You know, Mies van der Rohe had a famous saying that architecture begins when you put two bricks together. Well, I think Howard had somewhat the same idea about the importance of materials. I mean, he was not a form maker in the sense that he was not interested in doing kind of big stunts on the street corner. His houses are often very quiet and very recessive. They fit their sites very well, and the palette of materials is very, very rich. And I think so that you have this sense of, I always have the sense in Howard's best work of, you know, all of the things that we value in architecture about placemaking and light and materials kind of coming together in a very, you know, very refined, restrained, but assured way. So that I always feel, I feel in some ways the same way about Howard's houses that I do about O'Neill Ford's best houses, because I think he and O'Neill also had the sense about making places where people are comfortable, where they want to be, where there's, rather than showpieces. And Howard was not into fashion. Howard was not into really being a trendy architect. He was very much into, most of his work comes out of the convictions that he developed in his early work at the Bauhaus, with the Bauhaus people and Corbu and kind of classic modernist principles. Is where it's rooted in it. And I think it's very important to see that, you know, and to be aware of how it really works. And so I think, and as I said, so I don't think of Howard's work as being dated at all. I mean, you could go look at the Zale Lipsche house, which is now the house that the Clarks owned and now has been bought by another, I think, very sensitive owner. And you could make a rough guess at the date of that house, but I would say that you wouldn't say, you know, you'd still have a hard time pinning it down. It just sort of looks right without necessarily being able to say it was 1949, which I think it is actually. But it just sort of endures. It's just sort of a beautiful house and continues to be. I think Howard was a terrific assimilator and synthesizer of influences. I mean, clearly a modernist, but not, I think, a doctrinaire modernist, not an ideologue. I think he was someone who knew how to pick and choose and assimilate and incorporate elements. So early in his career, when he was actually working in New York in a little bit and then came to Dallas, clearly the early work was very much in the international style mode. It was very white, very clean, very crisp. And you could see the influence of Corbu and all of the whole internationalist modernist movement. There was another phase in which I think he was an admirer of Wright. And at one time, I believe, spent some time at Taliesin in Wisconsin. I don't know whether it was as a student or just a visitor. But he fell definitely under the influence of Wright. And you can see in some of his later work, like the Zale Lipsche house and the Sanger house on Reims and others, you can see a kind of Wrightian influence, particularly in the siding on the house, the redwood siding that he would use, and some of the using the rock and natural materials in a way that wouldn't necessarily remind you of Corbu, but was clearly influenced in some way or other. His little office buildings in Oak Lawn, which I think are pretty much ignored now, but have a wonderful clarity to them that's clearly, seems to me, shows some influence of Mies van der Rohe. So he knew what was out there. He knew what was happening, but he was never a copycat. I mean, he was never flip-flopping from one to the other. He was always pulling these influences into and synthesizing them with his own interest in certain materials. I mean, he loved stone, he loved Mexican brick, he loved wood, he loved native materials, and he was very sensitive to where he was, that he was in the Southwest, he was not in New York City. So he wasn't simply trying to impose an international kind of placeless model on here. But he was a synthesizer and assimilator, yet somehow he managed to keep his own expressiveness. Even when he was working at a very large scale, like 35-25, is still a prestige address on Turtle Creek, and was from the day it opened in 1959 or somewhere around there. But it's clad in this Mexican brick. You know, it has this wonderful soft brick that he used everywhere. And the same kind of concrete and things like that. It's so that even at a different scale, he's still doing the same kinds of things. So, you know, does he have a style? He has a way of working, I think, more than we would say a style. I mean, there's nothing. So, just a methodology and a set of priorities and a set of basic assumptions and convictions, and he works out of those. And most of those are modernist in some form or other, but they're not kind of narrowly so. And as I said before, he could also take a break and do a French farmhouse or a Georgian house and do it very, very skillfully. And I think there was, at that time, and that was true a lot of the modernists of that period, who, even though they were known for X kind of work, could all just switch gears and do something else and not feel that they somehow or other had sold their soul to the devil for doing that. I mean, I think, and he could do that too. So there's more versatility and variety in his work than I think sometimes we think of. The other thing that I think comes across in Howard's work, or certainly came across when you talked to Howard, was that in addition to whatever formal inspiration he found in modernism and the international style, he also adopted or took over the social agenda that was part of modernism in the early years and then kind of just disappeared later. But Howard did public housing, for example. He did public housing projects in Dallas. He was interested in those kinds of projects. He felt that there was a certain kind of social responsibility that an architect had, and that it was important that they do work, they do public work, civic work, as well as other kinds of work. And I think he really believed that. And if you would talk to him at any length, you understood that there was, you know, that architecture was a moral undertaking for Howard. I mean, there was a kind of ethical component, a kind of responsibility that one had that went beyond just doing a good job, or beyond satisfying the needs of the client or meeting a budget. You know, one was responsible to other values and other issues. And he felt that very, very strongly. And again, it's one of the things that made him both, infused his work and also at times made him a very difficult person to deal with, because those convictions were deep, long-standing, and not about to be changed. But I think they were, I used to feel the same way about O'Neill as well, that there was, you know, O'Neill was kind of a pyromaniac when it came to burning bridges, but he stood for, I always thought, ultimately the best things and the good things. And I think that was always true. Howard was an architect of real convictions, moral convictions, and ethical practice and things of that nature. And he really lived that, I think. Well, I think it's fair to describe Howard's best houses in particular as sort of really well-made objects, as things in which all of the pieces somehow fit and go together and complement one another. There aren't any sort of gratuitous gestures in Howard's really good houses. I mean, the materials are well chosen. They're put together very, very, they're put together impeccably. The sense of the inside and the outside and how one resolves the differences, you know, the passage from one to the other is something that modernists were very concerned about, and Howard was very concerned about. But you get a sense, like in the Zale Lipsche house, for example, which I think